In 1883, the stagecoach brought Nash Tucker a mute Japanese girl, not a baker. He had sent east for someone to put bread back in his dead kitchen, and the agency in San Francisco sent him what they had. Left an orphan whose family had died on the overland trail. She carried a lacquered box of tools her grandmother had used in Kyoto, and she never spoke a single word, not to Nash, not to the town, not when the men came to take her back. What she did instead was make sweets, hand-sculpted Japanese confections, shaped like plum blossoms and autumn moons, each one a sentence her mouth could not form. Stay until the end to hear the words she finally said out loud, and what it cost the cowboy who had stopped believing he deserved to hear it. The Barty Ranch sat 12 miles out of Red Hollow in a fold of country where the wind came hard off the plains, and the only sound at dawn was the gate chain ringing against the post. Nash Tucker counted fence posts the way other men counted blessings, not out of hope, but because counting kept his hands moving while the rest of him stayed numb. He had been alone in that house for 9 years, ever since the fever took Clara and the boy who lived 3 days and never opened his eyes, and the ranch had learned to run on the muscle of him alone. The kitchen was the wound he would not look at, flour dust still ghosting the board. Where Clara used to roll out biscuit dough, the stove cold so long the iron had gone the color of old bone. The stagecoach arrived a day late, the driver red-eyed and short with the cold. Nash met it at the Red Hollow way station with the buckboard, because the buckboard was the truck of the day, built for hauling feed and fence wire, not for passengers. The driver offloaded a trunk, a canvas satchel, and a girl. She was maybe 12, small-framed and thin, in a way that spoke of hunger rather than delicacy, with jet black hair pinned in a traditional Japanese knot, and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the trail coat she wore. Beneath the coat, when the wind pushed it open, he caught the red of a kimono silk that had no business on a frontier road. She held the lacquered box against her ribs, the way a child holds a thing that's the only thing left. The driver handed Nash a creased letter. The baker he had paid for had quit in St. Louis, and the agency had sent what they had on hand, an orphan no family would claim, the daughter of Japanese immigrants who had died of cholera somewhere on the overland trail. The letter called her Michi. It said she didn't talk. It didn't say why. Nash read it twice, folded it, and put it in his coat, and the driver made clear in the way drivers do, without quite saying it, that the girl had nowhere else to go, and that the next stop for her was a logging camp that took orphan labor. Nash looked at her. She looked back. It was not fear, exactly, not submission, something quieter and more permanent than either, the kind of waiting that has already accepted the worst. He had expected a baker, and he had been handed a child who could not or would not say her own name, and the distance between those two things was the entire width of his next 9 months. He didn't curse, and he didn't argue with the driver, because there was no one to argue with. He picked up the trunk, set it in the bed of the buckboard, and held out his hand to help her up. She didn't take it. She climbed up on her own, settled the lacquered box in her lap, and looked straight ahead, which made the silence between them all the more complete. They drove 12 miles in that silence. Nash tried twice to speak to her, once to point out the river crossing, once to tell her the horses were gentle, and both times she turned her head the same fraction toward him and gave back nothing, not a nod, not a word, not even a blink that said she had heard. By the time the Barty barn loomed up out of the dusk, he had stopped trying. He set her trunk on the porch, opened the front door, and stood back to let her walk in ahead of him. The house smelled like cold ash and 9 years of a man eating alone. She stepped inside, and the house seemed to remember that it was supposed to be empty, and to resent the correction. Michi stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the dead stove, the way a person looks at a test they already know they will fail. The silence didn't break. It settled into the house like a third person, taking the chair at the table that Clara used to take, standing in the doorway when Nash came in from the corral, lying down across the hall when the kerosene lamps were trimmed for the night. Nash tried English first, slow, plain sentences, the kind of talk a man uses on a spooked horse. Then he tried gestures, a tilt of the head toward the table, an open palm toward the well, a point at the bedroom that was to be hers. Then he tried nothing. Mitchie answered all of it with the same still dark-eyed way, and after a week Nash understood that the silence was not stubbornness. It was a door that had been closed from the inside and bolted, and no amount of knocking from out here was going to open it. She ate the way a person eats who has learned that food can be taken away. Fast, eyes down, fork held close to the body, the plate cleared before Nash had finished his first biscuit. He began leaving bread on the counter where she could see it all day, and a bowl of dried apples, and a pot of coffee that stayed warm on the back of the stove. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask, and by the end of the second week she had stopped eating like the food was going to be snatched, the first change he saw and the only one he could name. Red Hollow got its first look at her on a supply run. Nash rode her in on the buttboard, the lacquered box between them, and tied up outside the general store. The town was small enough that a stranger was a week's talk, and a Japanese girl was something no one in those parts had a word for. The men on the porch of the barber shop called her Chinese, because that was the only country in the East any of them had heard of, and a foreman from the rival spread the Cattlemen's Association land to the south asked Nash across the street if he had lost his mind. Nash didn't answer him. He bought flour and salt and a bolt of cotton, and he bought her a pair of boots 2 sizes too large because the store had no pair her size and she would ruin her shoes in the mud before the week was out. She carried the boots out to the buckboard in her arms like something she didn't yet believe was for her. He didn't correct the men who called her Chinese because he didn't know the difference himself, not yet, and correcting them would have meant telling the town he had ordered a baker and been sent a mute child, a fact he could not yet afford to have turned into a story. So he let the wrong name stand, and he loaded her back on the buttboard, and they drove home in the same silence, and the only sound was the chain on the gate and the creak of the canvas. Michi began to map the ranch with her eyes. He would catch her standing at the well, counting the windlass, or in the doorway of the root cellar, reading the shelves of jars, or at the rail of the tack room, her gaze moving across the bridles and the hobbles, the way a clerk reads a ledger. She touched nothing. She only looked, and her looking had a quality of inventory to it, as if she were learning the place by the weight and use of its parts, the way her grandmother in Kyoto must once have learned a kitchen. Nash watched her do this for 2 weeks before he understood that she was not waiting for permission. She was learning the house the way you learn a language you intend to speak. On the 9th day she cornered a hen in the yard to gather an egg, and the rooster came at her and flogged her arm bloody. Nash heard the hen squall and came around the corner of the barn to find her sitting in the dirt cleaning the wound with well water and a thread torn from her own hem, her face dry. She hadn't made a sound. He knelt and took her arm without asking, and she let him, which was the first time she had let him close. But he wound a strip of his own shirt around the cuts, and she sat still under his hands, and the only thing between them was the rooster strutting in the dust, and the sound of his breathing, and hers even, matched as if they had agreed on the pace without speaking. It was not trust. It was a recognition, 2 animals in the same yard who had decided the other was not going to bite. That night, through the crack of her bedroom door, he saw her fingers moving in her lap, shaping something that was not there. The hands worked in slow, deliberate folds, pressing and turning an invisible thing, the same gesture over and over, the way a mouth repeats a word it doesn't want to forget. He didn't know what she was practicing in the dark. He only knew that whatever it was the one thing she had brought with her that the cholera wagon hadn't been able to take. She cleaned the kitchen stove at dawn without being asked. Nash came in from the corral and found her on her knees before it, the iron swept out, the flue open, a rag of charcoal in her hand, and the fire already laid. She had done it the way a person does a thing they have done 1,000 times, without fuss, without looking to see if anyone was watching. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and she didn't look up, and the only sound was the first catch of the kindling. Then she opened the lacquered box. Inside, fitted into grooves of red silk, lay a small wooden paddle, bamboo stick with a flattened tip, and 3 carved wooden molds, one a flower, one a leaf, one a moon. Beneath the tools, in folded paper packets, were dust of color, pink, green, a pale yellow, and a small clay jar sealed with wax that she opened and sniffed and set down again with a small shake of her head. She turned to his flour, his sugar, his lard, and she looked through them the way a carpenter looks through the wrong tools, not disgusted, but calculating what she could make them do. She worked the flour and sugar with her hands. What came out, after almost an hour, was not bread. It was a small, pale, sweet shaped, like a plum blossom, 5 petals, a center pressed in with the bamboo tip, dusted pink with something from one of the paper packets. It cracked at the edges because she didn't have the glutinous rice flour the sweet was meant to be made from, and she had made do with what his frontier kitchen held, and the substitute fought her at every fold. She set it on a plate. The plate was the one Clara used to use, the white one with the blue rim, the one Nash hadn't been able to bring himself to move from its hook in 9 years. Nash came in from the coral and found it there. He didn't eat it. He stood in the doorway a long time, looking at the sweet on the dead wife's plate, and the sweet looked back at him, small and pink and cracked, a plum blossom in a kitchen that hadn't held a flower since Clara died. Michi stood against the far wall with her hands behind her back, watching him watch it, and her face gave him nothing. Then she walked to the table, and with 2 fingers she pushed the plate 1 inch closer to him, and she stepped back. It was the first move she had made toward him in 3 weeks, and it was not a move that asked for anything. It was a move that placed something in front of him and waited to see what he would do with it. He sat down and picked up the sweet, and it was lighter than he expected, and still faintly warm, and it smelled like nothing. He had a name for, faintly sweet, faintly bean, faintly flower, a smell that belonged to a country he had never seen. He ate it, and the taste was quiet. Not the loud sweet of a frontier pie, but something that came in after the first bite and stayed the way a low note stays in a room after the piano is stopped. He didn't say it was good, and he set the plate down and looked at her and said, "What is it?" She didn't answer. She never answered, but she looked at the empty plate, and something in her shoulders changed, a fraction of a drop, the kind of release a body gives when a thing it has been holding has been received. The thing she had been shaping in the dark, he understood now, was this: the muscle memory of a craft her grandmother had taught her in a kitchen in Kyoto before the family crossed the ocean and died on the trail. Her hands had been practicing the folds at night so they would not forget the way a mouth repeats a word it's afraid of losing. The plum blossom was not the first sweet she had ever made. It was the first sweet she had been brave enough to lay down in front of a stranger. Why she had laid it on Clara's plate and not on any of the other plates in the house was a question he didn't yet know how to ask. The next morning there were 2 sweets on the plate, and one of them was a different shape. A second sweet appeared, shaped like a single cherry blossom, and a third, the morning after, a long green willow leaf veined with the pale yellow dust. Each morning a new shape, set in the same spot on the table, facing his chair, turned so the petals or the point of the leaf aimed at the hand he used to pick them up. Nash began to notice that she placed them with a deliberateness that was not decoration. She was pointing them at him. He didn't know what they said, only that they were said and said to him, and not to the air. He rode into Red Hollow and asked the one educated man in those parts, the old clerk at the land office, who had shipped out of Yokohama in his youth and could read a little of the language. The clerk shrugged and told him that the Japanese made sweets for tea and that every shape meant a season. a plum for the last cold, a cherry for the short spring, a maple for the letting go in the fall. He didn't tell Nash much more than that, because he didn't know much more than that, but he looked at Nash across the counter and he said, "She's saying something, Nash, I just don't speak it." Nash rode home with the words in his head and didn't answer them, because answering them would have meant admitting he was already trying to learn. The town's reaction to the girl had been climbing since the supply run, and it climbed another step the day May Ballard rode out to the Bartee under the pretense of bringing eggs. She was the rancher's wife from the next hollow, a woman with a soft face and a hard eye, and she came into the kitchen and stood and watched Mitchie sculpt a sweet at the table, and Nash could see her unsettled and fascinated in equal measure, the way a person watches a thing they have decided is wrong but cannot stop looking at. She left a sack of dried beans on the chair, and she didn't sit down, and at the door she turned back to Nash and said, "The association is talking Hiram Voss and his men, a white man raising a heathen girl, alone with no wife in the house. You know how that reads." Nash said he knew how it read. May said, "Then you know what's coming." She left the beans and the warning on the same chair, and she rode out, and Mitchie didn't look up from the sweet she was shaping the whole time she had been there. Nash began to read the shapes, though he didn't say so to anyone, not to May, not to the clerk, not to Mitchie. He just stopped asking, "What is it?" and he started leaving the plate clean, which was the only answer he had to give back. A plum blossom on a morning he had come in from mending 3 sections of fence in the freezing rain, worn to the bone, and the plum was the flower that endures the last cold, and he ate it and felt something in his chest ease that he hadn't known was tight. A willow leaf on a morning he had been short with her over a spilled bucket, and the willow was the tree that bends instead of breaking, and he set the plate down and looked at her and looked at his own hands and understood that she was telling him something about himself that he hadn't been willing to hear out of his own mouth. A cherry blossom on a morning the kitchen was warm, and the sun came in the window, and the cherry was the flower that's beautiful, because it doesn't last, and he ate it and didn't know why his throat was tight until he remembered that Clara had loved cherry bloom. The baker he had sent east for, he had begun to understand, was already in his kitchen. He baked the way her grandmother's people baked, not the way a frontier housewife baked, with bean paste and a bamboo stick and a lacquered box instead of flour and a rolling pin and a tin oven, but the work was the same work. She was putting something sweet into a house that had had none. The agency hadn't sent him the wrong thing. They had sent him the right thing in a language he hadn't known he was going to have to learn. At evening, after May's visit, he sat at the table and watched Mitchie clean the bamboo stick and fold the paper packets back into the box, and he said to her, without expecting an answer, "They're going to come for you." She didn't look up. She closed the lid of the lacquered box with a small click and set it on the shelf beside Clara's plate, and she looked at him for a long moment, and the look was not fear. It was the same look she had given him the day the rooster cut her, the look that was waiting to see what kind of man he was. Nash didn't know yet what kind of man he was going to be. He only knew that the plate on the shelf had the plum blossoms' pink dust still on it, and that the house smelled faintly of bean and flour for the first time in 9 years, and that he was not going to give that smell up without finding out what it cost to keep it. 3 riders came up the drive before dawn, their horses dark against the frost, and the sound of the hooves on the hard ground was the first thing Nash heard when he stepped out to the well. He set the bucket down and stood and watched them come, and the breath of the horses hung in the air like white cloth, and the men sat their saddles and didn't hurry. They were led by Hiram Voss, the foreman of the association spread to the south, a man who wore his authority the way a man wears a clean shirt to a hanging, neatly, without affection. The 2 behind him were hands, big, quiet, there to be the size of the thing if the paper was not enough. Voss didn't dismount right away. He held out a folded paper and let Nash come to him, which was a way of making the point that the paper was doing the talking and the men were doing the standing. Nash took it and opened it by the light of the lantern he had set on the well curb. It was not a warrant, because there was no sheriff in those parts who would have signed one for a Japanese orphan, but it was a custody notice drawn up by an agent in San Francisco, the same agency that had sent her, claiming Michi had been placed in error and was owed to a logging camp up north that took orphan labor in exchange for keep. The paper was legal enough to look legal, this far from any court that would test it, and Nash read it twice and felt the cold come up through the soles of his boots. Michi stood in the kitchen doorway. She had come out when she heard the horses. The kimono pulled close against the frost. The lacquered box not in her hands but set back on the shelf where she could see it from the door. She didn't run, but watched Nash the way she had watched him the day the rooster cut her arm to see what kind of man he was, and Nash felt that look on the back of his neck like a hand. The plate of sweets from the morning was still on the table behind her, visible through the open door, 3 plum blossoms in a row, pink against the white plate, and Voss's eyes went to them and came back to Nash, and something in his face shifted, not pity, calculation. Voss asked civil, low, since when did the girl belong to the bar? T. Nash folded the paper along its old creases and he handed it back. He didn't raise his voice, because the facts were already doing the work, and a raised voice would only have made him sound like a man who was not sure. He said one line, and he said it looking straight at Voss, and not at the men behind him, and he said it the way a man says a thing he has decided is true and will not unsay. That's my daughter. He said since the day she stepped off the stagecoach onto my land, and he didn't say any more than that, because any more would have been a story, and a story was what the paper was counting on him to tell. Voss looked at Mickey, then at Nash, then again at the plate of sweets on the table, the pink plum blossoms on the dead wife's white plate, and Nash could see him doing the arithmetic of a man 3 days' ride from any judge who would hear the case. The paper was not a warrant, and the men behind him were not paid to ride 12 miles back to town and then 12 miles out again to test it, and the girl was standing in the doorway of a working ranch with a man who had just called her his daughter in front of witnesses. Voss folded the paper into his coat. He said, "The association will remember this, Tucker." Nash said he figured they would. Voss turned his horse, and the 2 hands turned theirs, and the 3 of them rode back down the drive the way they had come, slow, the breath of the horses hanging in the cold air behind them, and the sound of the hooves died away toward the south. The kitchen was very quiet after they left. Michi stood in the doorway, and Nash stood by the well, and neither of them moved for a long count. Then she turned and went back inside, and he heard the small click of the lacquered box opening on the shelf, and then he heard nothing, because she didn't make a sweet that night, and she didn't make one the next night, and she didn't make one for 3 days. The plate on the shelf stayed empty. The house smelled like cold ash again. The town closed rank around the bar, tea, the way a fist closes slow and from the outside in. The general store refused Nash credit at the end of the week, polite about it, blaming the books, and May Ballard didn't come back with eggs or with anything else. A fence was cut on the south section, and 2 steers went missing in the night, and the hoofprints led toward the association land and stopped at the property line, which was the association's way of saying the paper hadn't been forgotten and the daughter hadn't been forgiven. Nash worked longer hours, said less, ate less, and the kitchen went cold again, the stove dark most mornings because neither of them lit it before dawn any more. Mickey stopped making wagashi. She cleaned the house, she tended the hens, she carried water, she sat in the evenings with the lacquered box closed on her lap and her hands still on top of it. Nash thought at first she was grieving the small voice the sweets had given her, the voice the riders had ridden up the drive to take away. Then he thought she was waiting for him to send her on, because a girl who had been passed from the trail to the agency to the logging camp would know that a man who had just made an enemy of a county for her might not be a man she could count on to keep her. He didn't know how to tell her she was staying, and she didn't have the words to ask, and so they sat in the silence and the cold and waited for the other to break first, and neither of them did. Winter set in early that year, the storms tearing through the territory like something living and furious, carrying ice that stung the hands and turned the breath to white cloth that hung in the air and didn't dissolve. The bar T was cut off for days at a time, the drifts over the gate, the road to Red Hollow, a white ribbon that no buckboard could break. Nash and Mitchie shared the house in a silence heavier than any they had sat in before, and the lamp burned late, and the wind screamed against the shutters, and the only warm thing in the room was the kettle. It was in that stretch that Nash began to talk to her. He didn't expect answers, and he didn't get any. And that was the point, because a man can say things to a silence that he cannot say to a face that will answer back. He told her about Clara, how she used to sing at the stove off key, and how he had pretended to mind it and would have given the ranch to hear it once more. He told her about the boy who lived 3 days and never opened his eyes, and how he had buried him on the ridge above the creek because Clara was too weak to be told and he had to do it alone, and how he hadn't cried at the grave because there was no one there to cry in front of, and he didn't know how to do it by himself. Mitchie listened. She didn't move. She didn't nod. She didn't lay a hand on his. But she listened the way the old clerk had said the sweets listened, with her whole body turned toward him, the angle of her shoulders and the set of her feet all aimed at the chair where he sat, and Nash could feel the weight of her listening the way you feel the weight of a hand on your shoulder, even through a coat. She was giving him the same thing the sweets gave, the full attention of a person who has decided that what you are saying matters, and she was giving it without a word, and it was the most he had been heard in 9 years. On the longest night of the year, with the storm at its worst and the lamp burned low, she opened the lacquered box. She had saved a small cache of the white bean paste and the paper packets of color, and she had been saving them. He understood now. For this, for the night, a person would need a sweet that said the unsayable thing. She worked by the kerosene lamplight, the amber light flickering across her hands, and the paste was stiff with the cold and fodder, and she worked it slow, folding and pressing with the bamboo tip, and what she made was a single sweet, shaped like a winter moon, pale, almost white, with a faint crack drawn across its face. He set it on the table in front of him. The crack was the point. It was a moon that had been broken and kept, a moon that had a fault line through it and still hung in the sky, and Nash looked at it a long time and didn't eat it, because eating it was not what it was for. It was for saying, "I know." It was for saying, "The door is still closed, but I am on the other side of it with you." He looked up from the sweet, and he looked at her, and he reached across the table, and he covered her hand with his. The first time he had touched her on purpose since the day the rooster cut her arm. She didn't pull away. The lamp flickered. The storm threw itself against the shutters. They sat like that, his hand on hers, the cracked moon between them, and the silence in the house changed, not broken, but softened, the way ice softens before it breaks. Spring came in mud and a hard yellow light. The bar T held. Nash had mended the south fence with his own hands in the worst of the thaw, working alone in the cold rain, because he would not ask the hands he could not afford and would not take the help of the men who had cut the fence in the first place. Mitchie began making wagashi again, but the sweets were different now, and her movements around them were different, and Nash could see she was preparing for something, not just leaving a sweet on a plate the way she had before. She asked him by gesture for the good cloth and the white plate with the blue rim, the one that had hung on its hook for 9 years and had come down only for the sweets. She asked for the kettle and for the dried herbs in the root cellar, the wild mint and the chamomile, and the pale green leaf she had found growing by the south fence and dried on the window sill through the winter. Nash brought them all and set them on the table and didn't ask what for, because asking would have made her stop, and he had learned by then that the sweets happened best when no one demanded to know what they meant before they were done. She built a tea ceremony out of what the frontier would give her. She had no matcha, the green tea of the ceremony her grandmother had practiced, and she didn't pretend she did, and she didn't try to make the frontier herbs into a thing they were not. She brewed them thin and pale and green in the kettle, and she strained them into a cup, and she laid the white plate beside the cup, with 3 sweets arranged on it in a sequence, left to right, the way a sentence is laid on a page. A cherry blossom, a maple leaf, and a third shape Nash had never seen her make, a small bundled form wrapped the size of a newborn's fist. Nash understood the sequence before he tasted any of it. The cherry blossom was Clara, the short spring, the beautiful thing that didn't last. The maple leaf was the letting go, the autumn of it, the grief that had settled into the grain of the house. The bundled shape was the boy who had lived 3 days and never opened his eyes, wrapped in a blanket Nash hadn't been able to look at since the day he folded it away. She had given his dead back to him on a plate in a language she had invented for the grief the old motifs didn't cover, because the canon of her grandmother's kitchen had no shape for a son who never opened his eyes, and so she had made one. She was saying their names for him, the names his mouth could not form, because her mouth could not form anything, and her hands had learned to carry the weight for both of them. Nash sat down hard at the table, manned, his shoulders folded, the way a wall folds when the last stone shifts, and the sound he made was not loud, because he was not a man who had ever been loud, but it filled the kitchen, and it was the sound of 9 years of hell breath coming out at last. He didn't weep the way the stories say men weep. He sat with his face in his hands and his back bent, and the small broken sounds came out of him, the way air comes out of a bellows, in rhythm, without his permission. The cherry blossom and the maple and the bundle boy sat on the white plate in front of him, and Mishi didn't move, and she didn't touch him, and she didn't look away. She had done what her hands could do. The omotenashi of it, the thing her grandmother's people called the hospitality that anticipates the guest's need before the guest voices it, was complete. The plate held his grief, and the cup held the bitter green tea to wash the grief down, and she had placed both in front of him and stepped back, and now there was nothing left for her hands to give. The rest was up to the part of her that hadn't worked since the day the cholera wagon took her family, the part that lived behind the bolted door, the part that hadn't opened her mouth in 3 years. She stood across the table from him, and she waited the way she had waited the first day in the kitchen doorway. For the test, she already knew she might fail. The kettle sang. The lamp burned kerosene amber, and the room was small and warm and smelled of bean paste and wild mint and the cold rain coming in through the crack in the shutter. Nash was bent over the table, and Mitchie was standing, and the silence between them was the same silence that had moved into the house the day she arrived, except now it was full instead of empty, full of everything her hands had said and everything his back was shaking with, and it couldn't hold any more. She opens her mouth. The first sound isn't a word. It is a breath. Raw, dragged up from somewhere behind the bolted door, the sound of a thing that hasn't moved in 3 years, breaking loose from its hinges. Nash lifts his face out of his hands. He doesn't speak or reach for her, but waits, because he has learned by now that the things she gives are given in their own time, and that reaching for them early breaks them. The word comes out low and rough, a word in the language her grandmother spoke in Kyoto, the word for the thing he has just become to her, the claim a child makes on the parent who has chosen her. It isn't the English word. It is the one she has left, the one that still lives in the part of her mouth the cholera didn't reach, and she says it once, and her voice cracks on the single syllable, because the voice has forgotten how loud it can be, and the word comes out smaller than she means it to. It doesn't matter that it's small. The door is open, and the word is through it, and the kitchen holds it the way the white plate held the sweets. Nash looks up at her. His face is wet, and he doesn't wipe it, because wiping it would mean looking away from her, and he will not look away from her now. He doesn't correct her or ask her to say it in English so the town can understand it. He doesn't say anything back, not yet, because the word she has given him is the kind of word that asks to be answered with a thing and not another word. He picks up the bundled shape from the plate, the sweet she made for the boy who never opened his eyes, and he eats it, and he keeps her gaze while he eats it, and that's his answer. The dead swallowed and kept. The son she gave him on a plate taken into the body that hadn't been able to hold him. The second word comes easier. The way the second stone of a wall is easier than the first once the foundation is set. She says his name, the western one, the one the town uses, Nash, and the word is rough in her mouth because she has never had to shape it before, and she says it twice, as if to make sure the mouth can still do the work it has been asked to do. Then she stops. 2 words is all the door will give today. 2 words is the whole of what 3 years of silence will yield in one kitchen on one spring night, and it's enough, because the door is open now, and tomorrow it will give a little more, and the day after that a little more, and that's how a voice comes back. Not all at once, but the way a river comes back in the spring, one crack in the ice at a time. Nash reaches across the table, and he takes her hand, and she lets him, and this time it isn't the careful letting of 2 animals in the same yard. This time she turns her hand under his and closes her fingers around his, and they stand like that in the kerosene light. The white plate between them with the cherry blossom and the maple still on it, the cup of bitter green tea going cold beside it, and the kitchen is quiet, and the quiet isn't the silence of the first weeks. The silence of a door bolted from the inside. It is the quiet of 2 people who have said the only 2 words that mattered and are resting before the next ones come. The next morning Nash walks into a kitchen that smells of bread. Mitchie shapes dough at the table, flour on her sleeves, and on the plate beside it sits one pale plum blossom sweet. She looks up and says his name. He sits down. The town will remember. The fence will be cut again, but the kitchen is warm. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.